tragedy of life, and that's so in the Passion of the Christ, in that story, Christ of course encounters Satan in the desert, and so and is tempted there, and so that's the encounter with evil, archetypally speaking. And then the crucifixion itself is the encounter with the tragedy of life, right? It's betrayal and death voluntarily accepted. And so I understood that that was a symbolic representation of the Logos, and that was the embodied manifestation of this heroic path that mediated between these two extremes. That was really useful. Like, that was a really useful discovery for me. And because there was implications to it too, and profound implications that also seemed to work out in relationship to what I was learning about clinical psychology. So for example, one of the things you do if you're a clinical psychologist is you help people learn to encounter things that they're afraid of in a controlled manner, and they don't get less afraid, they get braver. So you actually act out the process of confrontation with tragedy, voluntary confrontation with tragedy, and that's curative. It doesn't matter if you're exposing them to their past or their present or things they're worried about in the future. As long as they decide to do it voluntarily, they get stronger and better. So you think, well, what's the limit to that? Well, the limit is to accept the limitations and catastrophes of your own mortality voluntarily. And that's potentially the proper pathway through life, or at least it's the least bad pathway through life, which is something, you know. And then I think the same can be said fairly decisively for the willingness to grapple with malevolence on a personal and individual level, you know. And so anyways, I started to lecture about that and to lay out those ideas more and more clearly over the years as I've been lecturing. And that's what I did for TV Ontario. And I think that that's why the lectures became popular, because, you know, I put some words to ideas that people already knew and could revitalize a symbolic vocabulary that people had become divorced from, and that there was a hole in the culture exactly where those ideas needed to be. And so people found that they were, well, people tell me when they come and talk to me, they said, well, when you're talking, it's like I already know what you're saying, but I don't have the words for it. It's like, well, that's exactly what an archetypal story is like, is that you all know the story, you just don't know you know it. Or you know at a level that you can't articulate, but you still recognize it when you see it, and you still act it out, and you see it in other people. But it's really, really, really good to have the words. And that's partly why you should be very careful about what you say, particularly careful about what you write. Now anyhow, after the big ideas thing, Wodek came into my classes and taped Maps of Meaning and made 13 30-minute TV shows out of them, and that was pretty interesting, and they were broadcast and kind of evanescent, because at that point they weren't put on the web, so they're broadcast, they pretty much disappear, right? And so fine. So, and I got some degree of, what would you say? I was exposed, my ideas were exposed to a large number of people, tens of thousands of people as a consequence of that. And that seemed to go pretty well. And so then YouTube came along, and I thought, well, I don't know what this is, this YouTube thing. You know, the comment section makes you, like, what would you say, wary about being human, I would say, generally speaking. And, you know, there was a lot of, well, there were a lot of things that it would be easy to be contemptuous of on YouTube, like the canonical cute cat videos, but I'm actually not so contemptuous of that, or the interesting animal videos, because I think they actually speak to a part of people that's actually quite good. We like cats, we like dogs, we think animals are kind of cool, and, you know, we take a break and look at something that's pleasant and cute, and maybe that's not so bad. It's not serious, but it's certainly not malevolent, and that's something. So I thought, okay, well, I'll find these old videos I did for TVO, and I'll put them up on YouTube, and maybe I'll just tape my classes. And so I set up because I have this theory that if it's worth doing badly, which, you know, it's true, but it's also true that if it's worth doing well. You just need to know when to apply those two principles. And if you're loath to do something and procrastinating, then sometimes it's better to do it badly. And I thought, well, I can't get a whole production studio up and running, and because I just don't have the time. I'll get an iPad and learn to use it and get a lavalier mic and just set the thing up, or maybe have a student film it. And so I did that for a couple of years. for my personality class in this Maps of Meaning class, which is the class where I outlined the sorts of ideas that I just described to you. And last April, I noticed that I'd had 1 million views and about 15,000 subscribers, you know, and I thought, 1 million views, eh? That's actually a lot of views. It's like I've never read a scientific paper that's been read 1 million times. No one has. That just never happens, right? That happens 0 times. If you have a paper that's cited, you know, someone else refers to it in one of their scientific papers 100 times, it's like, that's a home run. And 1,000 times is a miracle. So, and then if you write a book, you know, there's, I think, 1.2 million books published last year, something like that, and I think 500 of them sold more than 100,000 copies. So that's a sea of books, right? It's an ocean of books, and all of them failed. Really, so many of them failed that you might as well never write a book, because the probability that it will fail is like 99.99%. And that would be very depressing if it wasn't the case that that's the case for anything creative you ever do. So it's just baseline probability. But I thought, well, if I wrote a book and it sold 1 million copies, man, I'd be out dancing in the street. Probably not, but you know, you get the idea. So what does it mean to have 1 million YouTube views? Well, who the hell knows, right? I mean, we don't have metrics for that. We don't know what sort of influence that's having. We don't know anything about that. We don't know whether we should take it seriously or if it's, or who you're talking to or anything. But I thought, well, still, it's 1 million, and that's a lot. And I thought, well, maybe this is a more serious thing than I initially envisioned. And then I really thought about it, and I thought, oh, I get it. Here's a hypothesis. You know, back in medieval times and before, if you wanted a book, someone had to copy it by hand. And so there weren't many books, and they were very expensive. And then Gutenberg came along and invented the movable type press, and it was like, poof, books were inexpensive, and everybody could have them. And that was a major revolution, right? Within 400 years, almost everyone in the Western world, and then very rapidly, almost everyone in the entire world was literate and could read silently even, which was something that before that was reserved for a very small number of people, because most people read out loud when they read at all. So that was a massive revolution. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, maybe YouTube is a Gutenberg revolution, because it allows the spoken word to have the same reach and longevity as a book. For the first time in human history, spontaneous speeches can reach an infinite audience for an unspecified duration of time. Well, that's a whole new thing. That's an entirely new thing. And maybe it's easier for people to listen than it is for them to read. You know, I mean, I'd rather read than listen, because I can read way faster than I can listen, but people will listen to a YouTube video at twice the normal speed, sometimes more, so you can circumvent that. And then also, with a YouTube video, if you convert it into a podcast, let's say, which I'll get to in a moment, you all of a sudden have way more time than you used to have, because you can listen to a podcast while you're doing other things. So you can do the mundane things that you have to do from day to day, like commute and so on. But you can listen to a podcast. And I found that my students, my young students, are now listening to podcasts instead of music. And that's really something, you know, because music, of course, has been an unbelievably dynamic cultural force for maybe the primary artistic cultural force for what, maybe since the 1950s anyways. And that's being supplanted to some degree by podcasts. And that's really something. And then it also turns out that people have an appetite for long, detailed podcasts that are deep and informative. It's like, who the hell would have guessed that? Like, no one. It just sort of came out of nowhere. And so I thought, well, maybe this is worth taking seriously. And then, like, at the same time, I've always been interested in entrepreneur types and creative types. They're high in this big 5 personality trait called openness. And they're the people from whom all innovation flows. But it's very hard for creative people to monetize their creation, because to monetize something, you have to have the idea, and then you have to translate it into a product, and then you have to bring it to market, and then you have to sell it, and then you have to develop customer relationships and customer support. And it's like, by the time you do all that, if you're the creative person, you've either been bought out and shunted to the side, or you're dead. So you don't get to have the money. You produce the value, but you can't monetize it. It's a big problem. It's why it's so frustrating to be a creative person often. So I was looking around for ways that creative people could monetize their production online, mostly because I'm like far too curious for my own good. And my wife went off to visit her father for about a week, and I had a bunch of time. I could stay up till 3 in the morning, which I shouldn't do, and work. And I found this site called Patreon, and Patreon allowed, you know how Patreon works, it allows people to make voluntary donations to support creative people who are basically usually making their work available for free, which is, I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. It's appealing to the basic human desire for reciprocity. Like, people actually don't like getting something for nothing. It kind of puts them in existential debt. And so people generally feel that if they've received something of value, that they would like to give something of value back. Now, not everyone, but most people. And I thought, well, what the hell, I'll set up a Patreon account and see what happens. So it took me about like 6 hours or something like that to figure out how to do it exactly, and how to make a little, a banner on the YouTube videos that was linked to the Patreon account. There was all sorts of little weird tricks that you had to learn behind the scenes, and I thought, well, whatever, we'll see what happens. And then at the end of that month, I had about 50, 60 subscribers and about $500 US a month. And I thought, that's pretty interesting, I don't know what to make of it, but I could take that money and increase the production quality if that keeps happening, and I'll just run this and keep seeing how it works. So, okay, so that was pretty interesting. And so I thought through what it meant, what YouTube meant, that it was a Gutenberg revolution and it deserved to be taken seriously. And then I found this platform for monetization for creative people, and the two things were married, and that was April last year. And then at the same time, I was writing a book, which is called 12 Rules for Life, and some of you may have, or there's some flyers that are going to be distributed that tell you about the book, but in any case, I was writing this chapter in the book called Don't Bother Children When They're Skateboarding, and it took me deep into the polarization of society, because I wasn't very happy about the fact that children are overprotected, and that adventurous children, like skateboarders, for example, are often shut down when they're manifesting their bravery and their stupidity often, but that's not always distinguishable from bravery, right? Because that's like the trickster figure that Jonathan was talking about earlier, and it's not always that easy to segregate the people who take unreasonable risks from those who are courageously extending their competence into the unknown. And so anyways, for reasons I won't tell you about, that took me deep into the political polarization landscape with the increasing tension between the left, which I think is becoming increasingly totalitarian, and the right, and also with what seems to be something like an assault on, well, Jonathan called it the logos, which I think is exactly right, which I think is a reflection of Nietzsche's Death of God, and an assault on masculinity, which is often now seen as toxic or part of the oppressive patriarchy, etc., etc. And so this was kind of making my blood boil while I was writing this, because you get tangled up in that, and it's kind of emotionally distressing. And I saw the spread of these sorts of radical leftist ideas through campus, and I thought we killed all that off back in the 1990s. There was a spike of political correctness in about 92, and I was in Boston at that point, and it kind of got pushed back and it disappeared, and I thought, well, that's good, that's gone. And then the economy boomed like mad in the US, and people had other things to concern themselves with, and then all of a sudden, 3 years ago or so, it was like, wow, this is back with a vengeance. It's like we ain't seen nothing yet. And so that was bothering me. And then in my clinical practice, I had a couple of clients who had been bullied into poor states of mental health by social justice warrior types at 3 different workplaces. And they were quite different people, Some of them more left-leaning, some of them more right-leaning, but all had the same story, as they were sensible people, and now they were required to do things at their workplace that they just couldn't tolerate doing, like sensitivity training or unconscious bias training. Or here's one story. God, this woman that I was working with, this is the stupidest story. I wouldn't even believe it, except she showed me all the emails. She worked at this large bureaucracy We'll leave it at that. And the people at the bureaucracy would make presentations with those, you know, those boards that you can set up that have big pads of paper on them. Well, those pads of paper that you can flip are called flip charts. Okay, and so, but somebody got it into their head, and this was the manager of this particular client, that flip was a racist term, because apparently you can call Filipinos flips. I didn't know that. And so flip chart is actually insulting to Filipinos. So then she showed me this string of like 30 emails that had gone back and forth within her company from the management and a bunch of people, you know, the typical suspects who were all concerned about this, and they ended up banning the word flip chart. And you know, she was coming to talk to me saying, look, this is actually driving me crazy. I can't believe that people are spending their time doing this and that we're required to assent to it as if it isn't insane, which of course it is. And so, then I got wind of Bill C-16, and I'd been looking into the Ontario Human Rights Commission already at that point, and I wasn't very happy with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. I think it's a fascist organization masquerading under the guise of compassion, which is very, very typical and very intelligent. Like, if you're going to be a power-hungry authoritarian who wants sensorial control, the best way to allow yourself to be able to look at yourself in the mirror without screaming is to wear a mask of compassion, which is exactly what I think is happening. And Bill C-16 came out, and it purported to add transgender rights to the list of protected rights in the Canadian Human Rights Code and in the Criminal Code. And like it was one of those Trojan horses that Brett Weinstein just talked about. You read the legislation, it's only 2 paragraphs long, you think, oh yeah, Canadians are being nice to people who, you know, are in a strange category and get oppressed. That's the surface of it. But then I went back and I read because they said on the federal website that it would be interpreted in accordance with the policies developed by the Ontario Human Rights Commission. So I went and read those policies, and I thought, man, first of all, they were completely incoherent. They were extraordinarily poorly written. They were philosophically appalling. And they couldn't have been designed to get more people in trouble if that would have been the purpose of the design. So for example, if you're a business owner, they're not pro-capitalist, let's put it that way. If you're a business owner, you are as responsible for the utterances of your employees as if you were uttering them yourself, if the employee's utterance caused offense, whether or not they meant the offense, and whether or not there was any offense taken on the part of the person that was being offended. It was like, my God, really? That's really the rule? And that was like one of the, and there was another rule in there, which was that the Ontario Human Rights Commission could suspend jurisprudential tradition in pursuit of their goals. It's like clause 13A. You know, just 13A, it's just a little clause. We can ignore all legal precedent. So I was reading this and I thought, what the hell? This is absolutely insane. And then at the same time, the university, HR department, and equity, right? Equity, that's you hear that word, someone utters that word and you know they're ideologically possessed. So you move away from them, right? You move away from them. Because equity is it's a terrible word. It's one of those words that masquerades as compassion. It is a dreadful, terrible word. So anyways, the HR and equity department had decided that, you know, the university was rife with systemic racism, and that was all implicit in our unconscious biases, and that all the staff, HR staff, would have to undergo mandatory unconscious bias retraining. Well, then I thought, okay, come on, really? First of all, you're using the implicit association test, right? And I can tell you a little bit about that test, but only tell you a little bit. To use a test to diagnose an individual, the test has to pass certain standards of reliability, which means it measures the same thing within the same individual, the same way across time. Because it's like, otherwise you have a ruler that's made out of rubber. It's not helpful, right? It has to produce the same results with repeated administrations. And it has to predict behavior in a way that's consistent and with some degree of power. Okay, well, the IAT is not reliable. Not nearly reliable enough to be used as a diagnostic instrument. And it's not particularly valid. it predicts a little bit of behavior, but not much, like a fragment of behavior, maybe enough to even have a significant effect from time to time, but it's a small fraction. So your unconscious biases, which are actually indistinguishable from your perceptions, or maybe even your in-group favoritism, and people are characterized by in-group favoritism, which is why we like our families. It's not easily distinguishable from your reaction to novelty as well, because your implicit racial prejudice under some conditions is indistinguishable from your preference for familiarity over novelty. So like the psychological community is by no means united on what the implicit association test means. By no means. And it has plenty of severe critics. And even the people who have produced it admit that it shouldn't be used for diagnostic purposes. Wink, wink, wink. So, and then there's no evidence whatsoever that unconscious bias retraining, especially if it's mandatory, first of all, reduces unconscious bias, which you can't measure very well anyways, or has any positive effect on explicit behavior. And so I thought the attempt by the HR department to make that mandatory was an unwarranted intrusion on the civil rights of the employees,